Hey guys, welcome back to the What is Money show. I am honored and thrilled today to be sitting down with Mr. Jimmy Song. And we're going to be exploring what I think is probably one of the most important books someone living in the year 2021 can read, specifically chapter 1, which we will be focusing on today. The book is titled Democracy, the God That Failed. And very excited to be talking about this book with you, Jimmy. So welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. And it's, I know you always go super long with this. I'm a little nervous about how long I'm going to have to be on this podcast and to wait for, because I'm going to eat steak after this. I was going to do it before, but the previous thing landed a little long. So you're keeping me back from my steak, but so you'll be testing my patience to a little bit, to a small degree.
Well, I think you do have the world record for the most steak eaten in a single sitting. So don't want to get between you and that. You're lucky that this is pre-recorded, so we can take a steak break anytime you like.
Appreciate that.
As we were just talking about offline, this specifically chapter 1 and the introduction to this book are just, in my opinion, one of the most important things anyone can read right now, seeing what's going on in the world. It helps put a lot of the pieces together, I think, of what's going on with government and culture at large, civilization at large, even. It's as if we have kind of a failed or mistaken socioeconomic software implementation, if you will, with democracy. And, for reasons we'll get into, I realize that this may be a rather far claim for some people to come out and say, hey, democracy is a broken or flawed model. But I think the book here lays it out very intelligently. So before we get into that, I think we should talk a bit about economics. And as the author lays out in the introduction, the difference between empirical knowledge and a priori knowledge, or what we just also delineated as empiricism versus rationalism. I'll read one excerpt from the text here, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. And the author, the Hans-Hermann Hoppe, is that how you pronounce his name?
Hoppe.
Hans-Hermann Hoppe is the author of Democracy, the God That Failed, and this is an excerpt from the introduction. He said, if one is to make a rational choice among such rival and incompatible interpretations, this is only possible if one has a theory at one's disposal, or at least a theoretical proposition, whose validity does not depend on historical experience, but can be established a priori, i.e., once and for all by means of the intellectual apprehension or comprehension of the nature of things. Unquote. So, contrary to the scientific paradigm where we think it's all about observation, there is another realm of knowledge, right, where we can actually reason about things that we can't necessarily sense. So, and maybe that's the dividing line, is that empiricism relies purely on sense data, what we can see, hear, smell, feel, touch, measure, whereas a priori knowledge or rationalism can depend more on reason, and things like mathematics and geometry and physics somewhat emanate from this domain. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that divide.
Yeah, so this is, ultimately the divide between Keynesian and Austrian views of economics. And it's really about epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, right? Like we're making claims about how we come to know things. And empiricism is this idea that you only know things through observation, and that is the only route. And, Keynesianism very much falls into that empiricist camp. The other side is rationalism, which presupposes knowledge. A priori in Latin means from before. So before you do any observation, you have some theory that you can sort of test out and so on. There are rational things that you can predict based on the sort of like axioms and things like that you have. And this is what Austrian economics is based on. It's based on a priori knowledge, or it's rationalistic versus something like Keynesianism. And both are really claims about how you get to know things. And the thing about, Keynesian or empiricist models is that you have a tendency to sort of make generalizations where you haven't observed that much, or you don't, especially in a dynamic system like the economy, it's hard to isolate a variable, right? Like Bitcoin is the closest thing that we've actually come to being able to isolate a particular thing. But in general, everything is like entangled with everything else. And health observations and things like that come like in very much the same way, like where it's hard to isolate a particular variable. So when someone tells you, hey, like X is good for you, you have no idea that it was X or something else that you were doing, which is why like double blind control studies are so important for, drug testing and things like that, because you can control all of these variables. Yeah. But in an economy, you can't really do that. It's very difficult to isolate and say, okay, well, this economy, we're going to do X, and this economy, we're going to leave alone, right? Like, that generally doesn't happen. And the situations are very, tend to be different enough that you can't consider one a control group. That said, so empiricism tends to work better when you are able to isolate, but when you can't, well, you just sort of like come up with observations and make the observations sort of the goal, which is what Keynesians tend to do. They want to increase the GDP number, or lower the unemployment number, and doesn't matter about the quality of the jobs or the quality of the domestic product that you're getting, and so on. You could be building like all tanks and using them to destroy, your own people or something like that, and you would have a high GDP number, but you're not actually producing much. With that in mind, Austrian economics, I think, is a lot more rational and sort of gives weight to the metaphysical, right? It becomes a lot more philosophical, and I see science being a child of philosophy, where you are able to rationally figure out things instead of merely observing and trying to make rules about it. Although in that sense, that's metaphysical too. And I think that's largely the reason for the failure of Keynesian economic policies, because they try to just sort of take these aggregate numbers and say, well, okay, if we increase this, then this goes down. So for example, if you have rising inflation, then unemployment should go down. That was sort of like the theory behind the 70s until, like they actually tried it, and unemployment also went up along with inflation, which was, okay, why are we getting stagflation here? What's going on? And you can't really do that with an economy, because it's too dynamic, and just trying to manipulate the outputs is not good enough. Although that's sort of the current paradigm right now. And I think what Hoppe is an Austrian economist, obviously, and he does take the a priori knowledge and he's applying it essentially to a lot of history. And he does talk about World War I a lot in this book, and in the introduction specifically about like what happened there. But he takes it through sort of like a rationalist explanation of what's going on. And and he bases it in theory, so it makes a lot more sense. Instead of we sort of like being a strict historian, this is what happened, and this is what happened, and this is what happened. He's getting a little more into the why, and unfortunately, and this is probably part of what he's trying to establish here. History really is written by the winners, and they only let you observe what you want to observe, and they give explanations for why based on what they want you to observe. So, among other things, we've been told basically that democracy is the crowning sort of form of government, and the only thing that can actually work to secure human rights and so on. And this whole book is about putting that on its head and saying, you know what, here's the a priori rationalistic argument for why it doesn't work. And actually the observations that we've made over the last 100 years kind of show that we're going down this very bad path of all sorts of evil things happening, degeneration of all kinds. And really a decivilization of society that the opposite should be happening if democracy were this amazingly good thing.
Yes. So we have the empirical version of deriving knowledge, which comes from our senses, and we have this a priori method, which is it's more fundamental, right? Which, to your point, it's almost born of philosophy or part of philosophy, if we define philosophy as trying to get to the fundamental nature of things. But it's been largely disregarded by Keynesian economists. And, it's been, it almost, they like Mises said that economics is the youngest science. It's almost as if we've just recently in the arc of human history we've begun to understand that this method of deriving knowledge is more important to economics than Keynesian economics. And the analogy I like here is geometry, right? We know that Euclidean geometry has 5 axioms essentially from which all of its body of knowledge is derived. Economics, in the pure sense here, is sort of similar. We have like man must act, marginal utility of value, and things like this that we can derive many theorems from. Whereas Keynesian economics is suffering from more like the physics envy type thing that it seems like a lot of sciences suffer from, that they want super precise mathematical, empirically verifiable observations for everything to explain everything. And it's just not possible, actually. And there's a difference between physical and metaphysical, because it all comes down to the sense data versus deriving things from reason itself. So we know that mathematics is like the bedrock of civilization. And I think the awareness is dawning upon us is that economics is very close to that, and that it's derived from a priori knowledge. And then so he's using this platform, I guess this bedrock of reasoning, to make the case largely about, specifically in chapter 1, the relationship between civilization and time preference. So saying that the aggregate reflection of time preference in the world is how civilized we are, and how different governance models, specifically democracy versus monarchy, affect or influence time preference. So I'll read, I think this chapter 1, man, the writing is superb, and he just gets straight to the point. So I'll read his opening paragraph. He says, in acting, an actor invariably aims to substitute a more satisfactory for a less satisfactory state of affairs, and thus demonstrates a preference for more rather than fewer goods. Moreover, he invariably considers when in the future his goals will be reached, i.e., the time necessary to accomplish them, as well as a good's duration of serviceability. Thus, he also demonstrates a universal preference for earlier over later goods and for more over less durable ones. This is the phenomenon of time preference. So this very basic fundamental truth of living amid conditions of scarcity and having a finite life, from this bedrock that we all know and understand, he will reason forth about really, models of governance. So how do you, if he's explaining time preference in this way, is civilization just that? Is it just a reflection of aggregate time preference, in your opinion?
Well, it's the result of people having low time preference, right? Like, and it's you can almost like sense it, right? Like it's very obvious when you go to a city whether or not they have low or high time preference. So if you see graffiti everywhere, if you see rundown buildings, if you see, that's obviously high time preference. Like somebody like put a rock through the window or sprayed graffiti because they didn't care what the consequences would be or how the neighborhood would look or something like that. Whereas if you see something clean or, like some really nice classical architecture or building that's been there for a couple hundred years, that's immaculately maintained and things like that, in cities like, Paris or, some parts of London and things like that, you get the sense that this is civilization building. And it's the result of somebody that planned from a long time ago. Because it takes a lot to build, say, a cathedral. Those were usually like 100, 200 year affairs. And it took the community that like most of that stuff was built on volunteer labor too, right? Like it took a community of people that were willing to forego even something good within their lifetime and build something that would last generations for their legacy. And that's that's extremely low time preference behavior, not even being able to reap within your own lifetime, but within the lifetime of your children and your children's children and so on. That is what builds up all of these things. What he's pointing to here is that, as societies get higher time preference, there is a tendency to not build things that last, right? Like, and this is what he calls, I think, decivilizing versus low time preference behavior, which is literally just building things that last longer, instead of building something just for now. And you could kind of see it, a lot right now, even in something like architecture, because a lot of homes just get destroyed after 20 years. They're out of style or something like that. They're built with cheap materials, sheetrock and, wood and stuff like that to make it very easy to tear down and build it back up again. Whereas, if it's a cathedral, it's made out of stone. It's intricately carved. You have stained glass and all kinds of things that are very difficult to make, or at least that they were at that time. And take hundreds of years for that reason, but it's going to last a long time. There are cathedrals in Europe that have lasted over 1,000 years, right? Like that's really lasting. That's civilization building. Whereas, some of the stuff that's being built now is very high time preference. It's just for my lifetime. And, like for some people, it's even much shorter than that. It's okay, whatever I'm going to do for the next couple of years. And, some of the most destructive people are, people that are very high time preference. I need the next hit of a drug or something like that. Right. And they're willing to go and smash windows and steal from other people and do all these things that, like essentially destroy in order to satisfy their needs or wants for now. And that to me is the big difference between low time preference behavior and the high time preference behavior. Where I would disagree with Hoppe a little bit is that there is sort of like a morality component to this that I don't think he quite really articulates. He might even agree with it, but I don't think he really articulates, which is that, low time preference behavior is one aspect. That's what a Christian would call prudence, right? Like being wise about time and thinking ahead and doing something like that. But that's just one aspect. There are other aspects of virtue that also need to be present in order for civilization to really emerge. Those include stuff like justice and fortitude and temperance. So justice is like making sure that other people get treated fairly in whatever interaction. It's possible to be prudent but not just, right? Like and in that case, it would also be kind of decivilizing. I believe the Chinese emperor that created the Great Wall of China, like he predicted 10,000 generations, but he treated everyone so badly that the next generation, his dynasty got taken over, and he built something great, and it's lasted, but it's not. He didn't really build civilization per se because they didn't really last. And the other virtues like these would be the cardinal virtues, fortitude and temperance are also necessary. You can't just do you need to do things the right amount, which is kind of part of prudence. And you need to also be courageous about doing some of that stuff, which we can definitely talk about. It's hard to build things without some courage. It's hard to be an entrepreneur or to start something, given all of the uncertainty of the future, without some courage. And that's what fortitude essentially is.
Yeah. So it really does start with the relationship between you and yourself ultimately, right? That is really time preferences. If you consider yourself, I like the analogy that we're each a community of ourselves stretched across time, right? You're yourself today and tomorrow and the next day and so on and so forth. The lower your time preference, the more of that community you're taking into account of yourself. And then that's also the case with others. I think Peterson calls these abstract others, which is like your future selves and all the others around you. So lowering our time preference is expanding this concern for others effectively. And, virtue, I guess that's kind of the soil from where virtue springs a little bit. Like it doesn't just create virtue, but when you've lowered your time preference, you're more likely to adopt these different virtues that you're laying out here, because they're more suitable for dealing with, for taking care of that larger community. You tend towards more selfless behavior, I guess would be the general theme, versus selfish high time preference behavior.
And this is something that he points out, right? Like all about how if you are satisfied materially now, you tend to think a lot more about the future. But if you are not satisfied now, then you're going to think about now, and that's that is like low versus high time preference behavior. But there is some there is in one sense like virtue begets virtue, right? Like the more virtuous you are, the more virtuous you will become, because it will, satisfy you in certain other ways. But there is a sense in which you need to bootstrap this somehow, and that's not necessarily easy in a civilization or a society that is very high time preference, because it's hard to anchor yourself in at least, this virtue of prudence of thinking long term without, say, having a sound money, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the other point here that's real key is that time preference is always positive, which he pretty much lays out in the first paragraph. All things being equal, we always prefer, today versus later, unless there's the prospect of more later. If there's not the prospect of more later, we want to receive the good, the service, whatever it is now. But as we lower the time preference, as we said, it is actually encouraging us to live life beyond our own individual ego, right? We start to consider our future self and others. And to your point, it's not, I guess it's not, and this is where most things seem to be this way, actually. There's a reciprocity between them, right? You could have, you could consciously be more virtuous, and that would cause you to lower your time preference. Or perhaps there's some external incentives that could lower your time preference that could cause you to be more virtuous. There seems to be a feedback between the two. And so to connect this to the metaphysical or Christian domain, which I thought this was interesting, he makes the point that if man were not constrained by time, if there were no scarcity of time, that he would effectively always save and never consume. So this just sprang to mind, like, is that in Christian tradition, we talk about, God saving and Jesus saving and being eternal. It's like this, there's something beyond time that saves us in a way. And there, I don't know if there's a coincidence that the words saving and saved are the same, but they both sort of lead us the same direction towards this eternal timelessness. Do you think this is just related to those metaphysical principles that are kind of timeless for humans?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of debt as consumption without any savings, right? That's kind of the situation we're put in with the Christian conception of sin and our morals, is that every time we sin, we are essentially consuming without any saving. But the redemption of Christ is paying for all of that. It's paying for the debt that we've essentially accumulated. So in a sense, the constraint of time is allows for this debt accumulation, which from a Christian perspective, that debt gets paid off by somebody else, because we have no real way to pay for that which we've consumed, which I guess is in a sense a metaphysical consumption, and not just a physical consumption. So when the Christian conception is that every time you commit a sin, you're not just offending God. There's like a real debt, a metaphysical debt that is impossible to pay off. It's not something that we have currency in, right? Like the only one with money in that economy to be able to pay it off is God, and it requires Christ to pay that off. So to bring it back to sort of like the constraint of time, I think you need in that metaphysical realm, you need somebody that in that metaphysical realm, I think it's kind of timeless. I my philosophy there isn't completely developed. Yeah. So there is sort of like a timelessness to all things metaphysical. They just sort of exist, right? Like the number 5 didn't have a creation or something, right? But that requires a timeless being that can just sort of pay for it, and in a debt that's hard for us to really grasp because it is a metaphysical debt, and it is a debt in that realm of the spirit, as you would say, that it needs to be paid off. So yeah. It's like
this was from our recent book club, that connection between the words debt and deception. I think it was either in Hebrew or Greek, where they were almost synonymous terms. And that the word sin too is derived from, I think it's hamartia, which is the archery term for missing the mark. So it's like we're incurring these costs, and you don't need. You could consider sin in the very Judeo-Christian sense, or I really think about it as just missing the mark. It's like when we make an effort towards something, towards an aim, whether the aim was wrong or we just missed the aim, that's kind of a sin, right? You missed. And these virtues that we're alluding to, they certainly seem to be timeless, right? It's like no matter where in history you look, justice, fortitude, prudence, all of these things seem to be a net benefit to anyone in any situation almost. So it's very interesting making that connection. To take this back to the book here. So I think the next point he really lays out is the natural interest rate and its importance on time preference. So, and we often think of the interest rate as the price of money or the cost of capital, which is true in a sense, but I think more fundamentally, it is the ratio at which actors value the future to the present. So, one of the ways I think about this is if you have a higher interest in obtaining things now, right? You have a higher time preference. That means there's a higher interest rate. So you're discounting things more heavily, basically, from the future backward. And he goes into the point, really making the point that savings is that which underpins investment, and the interest rate is what mediates between the two, right? So the interest rate is incentivizing people to save, and it's also determining the demand for goods that people believe can contribute to outperforming that hurdle rate, right? So investors can borrow and use capital to improve civilization, frankly, and lower time preference further. So that's something that's very interesting. Is that we hear about interest rates a lot. We think it's some kind of obscure macroeconomic term, but it's not. It's something fundamentally psychological or perceptual, even, and it's related to our time preference. Is that how you?
Yeah,
how do you see that?
Yeah, it is sort of like a measurement of time preference, right? Because in a sense, the interest rate, at least in a sound money economy, it tells you something about how much they prefer now to the future. Unfortunately, in a fiat money system, the interest rate doesn't tell you very much. In fact, it is purposefully manipulated, because for a Keynesian, that's just one of the variables that you use to get the numbers that you want on GDP or unemployment or something like that, instead of what is, and it reflects more in your station in life rather than in your actual virtue, which I think, in a sense, this is what it's getting at, is the more low time preference you are, the more prudent you are, and the more the less of a discount you require in order to take money in the future instead of now. But instead, it's become this thing where it's dependent entirely on the access that you might have to certain loans. So if you're Mark Zuckerberg, you can get a mortgage at 1%. If you have a 750 plus credit score, you can get a mortgage at 3%. If you are, subprime or something like that, then it's scored a little differently and based more on your income or your credit history and things like that. Right. Which to be frank, that's not a terrible measure of time preference, right? Because a credit score tells the lender, okay, how many times did this person sort of like do badly once they got a loan? But it is interesting that you could kind of put a number on it. But it only really works when you have a sound money that isn't constantly changing, because the measurement is no longer valid once you have an inflating currency, because whoever is inflating it out is going to lend it out at a much lower interest rate than the market would. Yeah,
it's confusing because with the unnatural interest rate that we observe today, it's clearly at or below zero, which sounds great in this framework. It's like, oh, we're very civilized and things are doing well. But it's because it's manipulated. So the natural interest rate would actually be much higher. And so I guess fundamental to this, he makes the point that for animals, let's say, their natural interest rate is basically infinite, because they cannot overcome this impulse to consume and save the way humans can. Humans can reason about the world and ourselves, and we can decide, I'm going to eat a little more now and save for the future. and actually increase our productivity over time. Whereas animals are just kind of led by instinct in a way. So you could say then in that lens that this is almost the quantifiable metric that discriminates man from animal in a way, right? And the measure of a civilization would be getting that natural interest rate as close to zero as possible.
Yeah, I mean, to put a moral spin on it, I think what separates animals from humans is virtue. It's the ability to do good things, right? And if you are able to, not consume now so you can consume later, that is what makes you kind of different from an animal. That said, of course, like there are animals that plan for the future, right?
Yes,
like
of course.
Squirrels hide nuts, and bears hibernate by eating a lot more first, and things like that. But talking more about sort of like the long term and doing things that can help not just you, but your legacy and things of that nature. And for people like that, the natural interest rate does reduce. And I do think there's a connection here between this and sort of like the traditional, maybe Thomistic conception of usury, which is that for like a lot of church forefathers thought that, the only interest rate that you can charge is zero. And actually, like this is something that Safedean's told me about, his faith too, is that, in the Muslim world, the only legitimate interest rate that you can charge is zero as well.
Right.
And he's like, well, why is that? What happens as people become more civilized? Well, they lower and lower. You get lower and lower time preference, and I think it does asymptotically go to zero. And in a sense, like the process of civilization is an increase in virtue of all of its members, right? Like, right. And that eventually leads to a point where like you're willing to lend at zero, especially under sound money, because what you get back is worth more, even if it's the same amount nominally, because like things will have progressed in the, few years or a few months that you lent it out, where, things will be much, like technology will have progressed and more things will be built and things will get more efficient so that you'll be able to buy more with the same amount of money. So in a sense, maybe usury like laws do make sense, or at least considering a positive interest rate as immoral at a certain point when you have sound money, because it is ultimately an exercise of virtue, and like it helps the rest of civilization. But yeah, I don't like compelling anybody. So like, I don't know how like it could be considered moral but legal, immoral but legal, something like that. I'm not sure, but there is that connection there, which I hadn't really thought of until you brought this up.
Yeah. On your first point there, that animals certainly do seem to exhibit some kind of time preference, some more than others. But the big difference, it seems to be, is this human capacity to change our behavior, that we, you can consciously adopt a new lifestyle. Basically, you can program yourself to do something completely different. You don't see too many squirrels doing that, right? Like going on a diet, like a nut-free diet or whatever. And this idea of usury, I had a friend of mine tell me once that he thought that usury was outlawed because it was written at a time when hard money was the norm. So to your point, like if you lent out money at 0% and received it back, there tended to be kind of a built-in interest rate to that, because as the economy progressed, the money tended to appreciate in tandem. That it usually typically had, over average time spans, more purchasing power when it was returned than when it was lent out. So I think that's really interesting, but it seems like from a moral perspective, it would just be correct to let the market sort that out. Just let the market determine what the interest rate is. But I think that's interesting that, certain wisdom traditions, including Christianity, sort of say that usury is a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it kind of, it's interesting because I believe I read a book recently on like Catholic social teaching and stuff. I think it's now allowed for you to lend out as long as you're lending out at the interest rate that at which like the money is expanding, something like that. So I guess that would effectively be a 0% interest rate from a usury standpoint, and that might be a reasonable approximation of what would be is, all right, lending out at 7% in the current economy might not be so bad. Like that, that's actually like a decent return. And I think there's a lot of people that would take that in a heartbeat. So I mean, it might just sort of be the whole idea of usury might be like, don't go above or below the market, just lend at a fair price, right? Like, and 0% would be the fair price in a sound money economy. In a weird, corrupted money economy like we have today, the interest rate should probably be pegged to the monetary expansion rate, which is around 7%. And coincidentally, that's actually not like that seems pretty reasonable on both sides, right?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services, or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. Okay, so I'm going to branch now into this conversation on capital. And I want to read an excerpt again from chapter 1. Hoppe says, capital goods have no value except as intermediate products in the process of turning out final, which are consumer, goods later. And insofar as the production of final products is more productive with than without them, or what amounts to the same thing, insofar as he who possesses and can produce with the aid of capital goods is nearer in time to the completion of his ultimate goal than he who must do without them. And then in regards to the price of capital, he says it is the price paid for buying time, for moving closer to the completion of one's ultimate goal rather than having to start at the very beginning. This is something that's so philosophically interesting to me, that capital is time or time savings or a stock of time, something like that. And, he kind of explains it two ways. One is that it amplifies the production rate of consumption goods. So if we're trying to produce, we can produce more units of food per man hour, let's say. So there's a net increase to our utility of time through using capital. But he also says the holders of capital, which is kind of looking at the same thing from another way, the holders of capital are closer in time to the realization of their goals. So capital lets you just achieve your goal more quickly. So it's kind of a form of stored time in a way. And therefore, the cost of capital, which again is the natural interest rate, is just the price paid for buying time effectively. And again, we're looking at this gap between, we're humans living within time, trying to overcome the scarcity it imposes upon us. saving and capital accumulation, these are the scaffolding by which we build civilization, right? We're trying to pull ourselves up, bootstrap ourselves, I guess, out of scarcity and into abundance. And it's only through this act of saving and capital accumulation that we're able to do that.
Yeah, the whole idea of capital is interesting because it really is about investment in the sense that you are putting your time into something that will save you time later. So it's kind of like in Safedean's book, the whole analogy of building a fishing pole so that you can fish more efficiently, and then that leading to building a boat so that you can fish more efficiently, all the way up to today where you have these fishing vessels that take like 5 years to build, but once you build them, you only need like 12 men for a few months to catch like a million fish or something to that effect, where it's insane amounts of food that you can accumulate very quickly. Whereas, the very inefficient way of catching with your hands, to do that would take like a million lifetimes, right? Like to catch the amount that 12 men can do in like a matter of like 6 weeks or something to that effect. So that is really the accumulation, the virtue behind capital accumulation, is that it lets you be much more efficient with your time. And I think, as like Hoppe talks about in that chapter, all things are really ultimately sort of like human time, right? Like it's you have to turn something that's more or less useless. It's that whole homesteading, appropriating things that were considered useless, and then you do something with it and put in your labor and make it useful. And what capital goods do is like sort of multiply the effectiveness of your time. And unsurprisingly, that building the capital good also takes time. So in a sense, it because of the time cost of building the capital good, it ends up being a lot more low time preference, right? Like it ends up multiplying your effort later, but during that time, you're not getting the production that you would before. Right. So if you own the capital good, then of course you can churn out things much faster than your competitor or somebody else that doesn't have that capital good. And like these days you have many layers of capital goods, right? Like from people that know how to mine, steel very efficiently, to people, or iron very efficiently. There's steel mills or capital goods that are related to turning iron into steel very efficiently, and then there's other capital goods that shape the steel to some electronic part, and then other ones that take that electronic part and make it into part of your phone. And then there's you like using your phone to go trade for Bitcoin or something like that, right? Like there's so many levels of capital goods now, and each of them sort of multiplies the effectiveness of your time. And that's really, I guess, in a sense, what civilization is this great multiplier of your labor, to the point where you can like I'm a programmer, I can code things and live pretty abundantly as a result of being able to code, which like even the richest people even 70 years ago couldn't ever imagine being able to do with the scale that we have. It's an abundance multiplier. It's I suppose what civilization ultimately is.
Yeah. This amplification of labor efficiency, or a force multiplier on time, something like that. And if you look at it through the scope of, okay, we transitioned from being hunters and gatherers to an agricultural society some, I forget, 5,000-7,000 years ago. At that transition point, basically 100% of the human labor force is focused on agriculture, right? Or supporting agriculture directly. You're either farming or maybe making tools for farmers. Maybe you're defending the harvest from attack. But through this process of making the production process more roundabout, so saving more capital, allowing us to specialize further and further, we get to something more like today, where I think the numbers are sub 5% of the world population's focused on agriculture, right? So, 5 out of 100 people can now feed the 100. The other 95 can go and focus on satisfying other wants, more specialized, more specific wants for people. And it's, again, that scaffolding through which we're creating wealth and abundance. And the author makes a later point that this creates kind of a virtuous cycle too, because as you accumulate more capital, you're able to go out and take even more risk, right? Or delay consumption even further. So the larger capital stock base we build, the even more roundabout we can make our production process, which means we can create even more wealth. And so that's the aim. That's the thrust, or that should be the thrust of a civilization that wants to live in wealth and abundance and peace and all these things. And so I think that's sort of the bedrock for how now he starts to explore monarchy versus democracy. And he segues into that by first discussing these different factors that influence time preference, which I think are important for evaluating the governance models later. So the first category of factors he discusses are external factors influencing time preference. And the general dichotomy here is, so if you have an expectation of a positive future, so things are going to be better in the future, this tends to make you want to save less today because you think things are going to be better in the future, so it doesn't necessarily matter as much. Whereas if you have an expectation of a negative future, it would actually lower your time preference. You would want to accumulate more capital, accumulate more options, basically, for whatever the negative future you're moving towards. I'm wondering, is that why so many people are hoarding dollars today? We see so much on the sidelines. This is just, people are kind of forced to be prepared for an anticipated negative future.
Yeah. So you made a really good point that Hoppe also articulated that I really don't want to miss, which is that wealth has a flywheel effect, right? The more wealth you have, the less concerned you have to be about now, and the more concerned you can be for the future. And that in turn builds essentially more capital goods that allows you to have more abundance later, which allows you to plan more for later. There's a flywheel effect, right? And it multiplies upon itself, and you get more and more abundance. The question then is really about, okay, what's on the other side of that equation? What are the forces or the incentives that cause people to have a higher time preference or to do all of these other things? And that's what we're talking about here. Okay, there are external factors that sometimes happen that cause us to either have lower or higher time preference. And as he points out, there are negative expected future events which will cause people to become a lot more low time preference. So for example, if you know that there's a hurricane coming to your town, then of course you're going to buy up groceries and things just in case something goes wrong. And in fact, if you I don't think many of us have been in war situations, but that happens all. If you expect a war, you hoard food, right? You hoard everything that you need because you have no idea what will get disrupted. You might not get access to food later on. There might not even be food available to buy. So you go and make sure you're planning for the future. And negative expectations sort of set us up for that. Now, to your question, is that why people are hoarding dollars? Yes, that is exactly what people tend to do when they expect bad things to happen. There's a flight to safety, right? Like they whatever is the most liquid, you're going to keep around. But that sort of assumes a functioning market. So in a sense, the people hoarding dollars are still expecting there to be a functioning market in the midst of whatever chaos they're expecting. So probably they're expecting some sort of like economic disruption of some kind, but not a complete market disruption where goods aren't coming to the market and so on. And I don't know if that's exactly the right thing to be doing. Although there are people. I believe every Mormon is supposed to like keep like a year's stock of food in their basement, exactly because they expect, just in case things go bad. And you can actually buy packages at Costco.com where they'll sell you an entire year's worth of food that you could store in your basement for like $3,000 or something. So there are things like that, that there are behaviors like that do happen. The other thing, though, about that is after it passes, then everyone's time preference like just sort of shoots up. It's kind of a spring. And I think we're kind of seeing that right now because, I mean, we all remember like a year and a half ago, everyone was hoarding toilet paper and, like frozen pizzas and things like that because they had no idea what the heck would happen with the economy. But then as soon as like all the mask mandates started to go away and stuff, people started spending like crazy. You can't get anything now, right? Yeah. We're at a point where like no business can hire anybody, and we're you try to go buy furniture and nobody has any furniture. There's like supply chain problems all over the place. You just can't go. Like everyone is consuming, and the expectation is essentially temporary. It does lower time preference when you're expecting a disaster, but it comes right back up as soon as it ends. And you can kind of see that in a lot of like post-war scenarios where people just kind of go crazy and get drunk every night and do kind of crazy stuff because it's an artificial low time preference, if that makes sense. And that's the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And the way I think about it is there's the best antidote to uncertainty is options, right? So that if you don't know what's going to happen, the best preparation you can make is to have as many options available as possible, right? So you can deal with any eventuality. And it just seems like, to your point, it's the most liquid asset represents the greatest optionality effectively. So people are stocking dollars in anticipation of, being able to deal with any situation. The next factor he points to that influences time preference is biological factors. And I think the obvious one here is maturity, right? There's the old marshmallow experiment where the child's given one marshmallow now, but if they can, withstand eating it for 5 minutes, they get 2 marshmallows, and the kids that succeed in doing it tend to exhibit lower time preference and are more successful later in life, et cetera. Clearly, as you shift from childhood into adolescence and adulthood, you tend to have at least the ability to have a lower time preference. I would say on average, you probably have a lower time preference. But then he makes the further point that actually in senility, like when you get close to the end, your time preference tends to come back up because there's not much future left. So you're going to consume your savings or whatever capital you've managed to accumulate in your lifetime. I'm wondering, is this perhaps this idea that senility raises your time preference? Do you think this is contributing to the cultural divide in the world, and that we kind of have the baby boomers who control most of the wealth in the world now? I think the bulge of that demographic is in retirement age, and we have more entering retirement age every day. Do you think that's contributing to this little bit of chaos we're seeing in the world? Is this big demographic is getting their time preference pushed up just by virtue of their age and biology?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird situation that I don't think we've really seen in the world before, because in a sense, baby boomers came up in the age of like all these social services and the welfare state and things like that. So they're used to having things taken care of them, not by their parents, but by the state. Mm-hmm. And this in turn means that they are really high time preference, more so than you would be, say, if you lived 150 years ago, because you had to worry about, okay, well, what are my children gonna do, right? Like, and you didn't have just like 1 or 2 kids like baby boomers do today, but you probably had like 6 or 7 kids, and you worried about, okay, well, the first 4 are fine, but the last 3, they might, I need to make sure that they're taken care of, or that the first 4 are wealthy enough that they can take care of some of the, ones that are straggling or something like that. So there was a low time preference in the future, about the future, even in your old age, because of the legacy that you would want to leave behind, especially as you had children, because you still care about them, and that's an important consideration. But with baby boomers, like they had less kids than the generation before. They were the people, they were the baby boom, right? And they decided to have less kids and so on. So many of them don't even have kids. So for them, it's going to be much higher time preference. But even for the ones that did, they don't have as many kids, so they're still going to have relatively high preference compared to, say, people a few generations before. So to answer your question, is that why we're somewhat culturally divided? Because baby boomers do have sort of like a high time preference, compared to everybody else, like say people between the ages of 20 and 50 or something like that. That I guess that would be like Gen X and the millennials, something to that effect. They certainly have a very different perspective and might want to build things up a little bit more. I do think that there's definitely something to that, and especially in the last year, like going back to the whole COVID thing. Who were the people that were the most vulnerable? Well, it was the unhealthy older people, and most of those were baby boomers. All the decision makers were more or less baby boomers, right? Like they're much older. And they impose sort of this very high time preference lockdown on everybody else who weren't in danger. Like if you're a healthy young adult, it did not matter whether you caught COVID, you would survive. So in a sense, that is the big sort of like cultural divide that contributed to the division we have today, which is, like you have a lot of people that, I mean, you have a lot of different divisions, but this one of the major ones that were caused in part by the boomers' extraordinary high time preference.
Yeah, just such a confluence of factors. And there's kind of a bell curve, as we just said, like earlier in life, you tend to have a higher time preference. I imagine even in your early 20s, a lot of people are just kind of spending, not saving as much. Then you get into your prime earning years, which I think is somewhere like 28 to 44, maybe. People tend to get a little more focused on savings, lower time preference. And then in older age, you kind of flip back to high time preference again. Really interesting. And then we'll get into, like, clearly fiat currency has a big influence on that, which I think we'll get into here. But this was going deeper to the factors that influence time preference. I thought this was excellent. We're now in kind of the personal, social, and institutional factors. Hoppe makes the point that savings, it's not just lowering the time preference of the individual, right? That it's actually creating more investment in the economy, which is increasing. Maybe I'll just read this excerpt real quick here. So Hoppe says, quote, moreover, in an exchange economy, the saver/investor also contributes to a lowering of the time preference rate of non-savers. With the accumulation of capital goods, the relative scarcity of labor services increases, and wage rates, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, will rise. Higher wage rates imply a rising supply of present goods for previous non-savers. Thus, even those individuals who were previously non-savers will see their personal time preference rates fall, unquote. So this process of saving, it's not just for the individual saver. It's actually creating an influence on the time preferences of others around them, not even around them, just in the economy, to actually induce a lower time preference. So, I mean, savings, it's almost indistinguishable from civilization in a way. It's like the more we save, the more capital we accumulate, you're actually fostering civilization, not just within yourself, but without as well.
Yeah, and we talked about capital goods sort of being a multiplier of the labor of your time. Savings is really a form of a capital good, right? Like it has that same flywheel effect where the more you have savings, the more capital goods you get. The more capital goods you get, the more efficient everything is. The more abundance there is, and the less needs you're going to have, because everything's going to be cheaper, and you're going to be able to afford everything. And that in turn means that even for non-savers, they're able to get things more cheaply, and they'll have more abundance, in which case they can invest in longer term things because their current needs are satisfied. That is certainly not the case for most people today because of debt, right? Like this is the opposite of saving, and it does all of the opposite, and it also has a flywheel effect, which is very unfortunate. But the saving part is literally building up civilization. It's creating capital goods and multiplying the labor of each person significantly, so that you can do a lot more with the short amount of time that we have on Earth, and that in turn causes everyone else's to get more efficient as well, because you're able to sell those goods at a cheaper price to everybody else. So it like essentially, I think what Hoppe is describing is there is sort of like a natural virtuous cycle here at play, that as people save, they cause even more people to save. And that causes even more abundance and better goods and better products and better services. And again, this is only really available from a rationalistic a priori knowledge kind of theory, rather than sort of the Keynesian one, which says, okay, well, then investment numbers need to go up. So we're going to print money to invest in whatever, because then we're going to have way more investment in the economy, and investment is good, right? And we create capital goods. Well, no, actually, oftentimes what you end up doing is wasting it, and you make processes that nobody wants very efficient instead of processes that people do want efficient. And you have a significant inefficiency. And in order to fund all of that, you have to steal from everybody else. And really, you're stealing from their savings, destroying their capital formation and their capital goods in order to do so. So, this is where Austrian economic theory helps us to understand how this actually works, so that we can put the money into good use instead of wasteful use, like Keynesians tend to do.
Absolutely. It's Keynesianism is antithetical to this whole process, because their aim is actually to try and increase consumption in the economy, right? So I guess the theory there, or their perspective, is that by actually depreciating the dollar, at least this is the ostensible purpose, you're actually encouraging consumption. So you're stimulating the economy, right? That's kind of their go-to policy tool. Every time there's an economic shudder or shock, print more money, stimulate consumption, get things revved back up. But this is, does a number of things. One, it's destroying accountability, frankly. So the businesses that are not turning a profit by actually servicing the productivity of civilization, they're not wiped out and their capital reassimilated into other aims. And this, I think that's a really important point too, that accountability, or we could say skin in the game, right? Fiat and Keynesianism sort of eliminate accountability or skin in the game. That's a really important point later when we start to compare monarchy and democracy. In general, the monarch has a lot more skin in the game, frankly. And so this, fiat is actually incentivizing dissaving. So if we said that savings is civilization in a way, or at least the scaffolding of civilization, debt is the opposite of that. Dissaving and then ultimately debt is opposite to that. It's actually decivilizing. It's destructive. And this is something that is so deeply embedded in our socioeconomic system today. And the numbers are scary, frankly. I think it's 350% global debt to GDP. Last I checked, probably worse since. So it's really bad. On these other, again, looking at factors influencing time preference, makes this other great point that essentially voluntary exchange contributes to a lowering of time preference, whereas intermittent involuntary exchange, which we might call crime, right? If someone's taking something from you, actually raises time preference. And there's a interesting difference here, because crime is something that's intermittent and it can be insured against, right? You can hire security, you can buy insurance, whatever it may be. So there's a way to kind of overcome that risk or to hedge that risk, if you will. And he makes a point that once successfully hedged, we can resume the process of lowering our time preference or building savings, which is great. But when you look at government interference, it's this continuous involuntary exchange. There's no way to hedge against. I mean, there are ways to hedge against it, but before Bitcoin, let's say, there was no real good way to hedge against the predations of private property. Even holding physical gold is a better option than, say, holding real estate, perhaps. But we still had an executive order 6102 that they, outlawed the ownership of gold. So he makes the point that when it's continuous, that you cannot insure against it. And this has a really detrimental effect on time preference. So this whole, government intervention, government action, anytime it's non-consensual, it's extremely damaging to time preference and therefore decivilizing.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really good point that he made regarding trade, first of all, that when you do a trade and it's voluntary, that means that you're getting something that you want more for something that you want less. So by definition, because it's voluntary, you are getting more satisfied as a result of that trade, and that you have more abundance. And both parties to a trade do that. And this is part of the flywheel effect, is that if you have a capital good, or you have the ability to produce something in abundance, the marginal utility of an extra unit is probably not going to be worth very much to you. But if it's a first unit to somebody else, that's going to be very useful to them. Say you're a cobbler or something like that. Every shoe you make, you're not going to be using them. You probably have plenty of shoes already. But if it's the first pair of shoes for somebody, that's going to make them a lot more efficient, and it's going to be very abundant, even if it's their second or third pair of shoes or something to that effect. And whatever you get back, if it's money, then you can go use that to go buy something else that you need, like butter or something like that. But any voluntary trade, if it's shoes for butter, the butter is going to be much more useful to you than the marginal cost of the marginal utility of the shoe. So you're both sort of gaining in that regard, and that's a very good thing. That's part of the civilization building, and what's extraordinary about capital goods and specialization of labor and things of that nature. But the thing that he talks about involuntary exchange or crime is that it takes away from this virtuous cycle of capital formation and creating capital goods and specialization and being able to trade and everyone getting continuous abundance. It puts friction into this flywheel effect that we were talking about, because if you are the minute somebody steals from somebody or commits a crime in some sort of involuntary exchange, now you have to spend all this money on security, which before you didn't have to spend money on. So that's not a capital good, right? Like, it's not producing anything. It's a security good. It's to secure what you already have. And that in turn means that it's not actually beneficial necessarily to everybody else. It's not really building up civilization. One of the things that I find really sad is that you go to some of the poorest countries in the world and you look at their homes, and immediately you notice that they all have walls around them. Because if it's at all nice, right, or anything that people are going to come in and steal, and that means that they have to put all of those resources that could have been put towards another home, for example, so that they have to build walls and security and all this other stuff, and that's detrimental to that society. And this is why crime is in a sense so evil, because it not only steals the rightful property of somebody else, but it causes spending on stuff that doesn't necessarily produce anything. And his point about government theft is even more poignant, because in a sense, when government takes stuff away, you can't just build walls. I guess you can hire better lawyers or something like that, but there's no easy way, or there's no spending that you can do to prevent them from passing a new law to take more money away from you. Right. And that's the difficulty, is that because of that uncertainty, you're always constantly sort of discounting future earnings in relation to the expected amount that they're taking away. And that's not just like a one-time like rock into a flywheel or something. That's like a stick that's just there constantly slowing everything down. And that's much worse. And this is sort of like the framework in which he, evaluates government, is to what degree can they slow everything down and make things much worse? Because in a sense, I think he's an anarcho-capitalist. Like, no government is the best government, because at least you can have certainty and you can do things to prevent whatever crimes might be committed against you. But crime by government is just absolutely destructive in every single way. Despite them having written most of the history books and making themselves out to look amazing, that's actually, at least given this a priori knowledge, that's not actually how it is, and they're a hindrance more than anything.
Yeah, again, it's such a powerful point, actually, that we have in government this unhedgeable risk in a way, right? It's just like, you're going to be stolen from. You don't know how much, you don't know in what way, whether it's inflation, taxation, outright confiscation. He goes on, I think, to make the later point that even any limitation on what you can do with your property is a form of theft, right? So this could be certain, he talks about law and whatnot. And this, I guess, is the most detrimental factor to time preference. So this is the most decivilizing thing you can really do to a group of humans trying to organize themselves, is have this constant specter of theft and risk that you can't do anything about. You can't insure it away. You can't hedge it. And like you said, I love the stick in a flywheel. It's a great, it just gets worse over time. And to his point too, that these security costs, which, I mean, this is just for crime, you can build the walls, you can hire the security forces, whatever. They really would be wasteful if the property could not be stolen. Right. So it's almost like it's a waste of resources if the security were embedded in the asset, which is where something like Bitcoin, I think, really shines, right? It just has a security built right into it. So it allows us to free up these other expenditures on security and allocate them towards something more productive. And this idea, I think this is something I just really can't stop thinking about, that I think very fundamentally, voluntary exchange or voluntarism, maybe more generally, it's the only avenue to value creation, right? You cannot have both parties entering a transaction and leaving it better off unless it's voluntary. It has to be purely voluntary. If there's any coercion involved, it's necessarily, like, by definition, destructive.